Now to that highly anticipated verdict in the trial of Elizabeth Holmes. The Theranos founder was found guilty on 4 federal fraud charges for exaggerating her company's blood testing technology to investors. Now, Holmes faced 11 charges in total, but was acquitted on any that involved defrauding her patients. There's the big difference. She now faces up to 20 years in prison for each guilty count. Joining me now to break this all down is NBC News senior business reporter Ben Popken, who's been covering the trial. And we also have NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Good morning to both of you. And Ben, I will begin with you. So walk us through this verdict. There are a lot of charges, several different outcomes. What counts was Elizabeth Holmes convicted on, and where did the jury remain deadlocked?
Well, on the first count, conspiracy to defraud Theranos investors, the jury found Elizabeth Holmes guilty. On the second charge of conspiracy, not guilty. On counts 3 through 8, these were wire fraud charges connected to defrauding individual Theranos investors and firms. And this is where we saw a split. On counts 3 to 5, there was no verdict, the judge declaring a mistrial on these charges, which were for the smaller amounts of wire fraud in the indictment. But in counts 6 through 8, guilty for a total of over $140 million in fraud, $100 million from the DeVos family office alone. Counts 9 through 12, defrauding, conspiracy to defraud patients, not guilty. And earlier in the trial, the 9th charge was dropped.
Danny, let's bring you in here and focus in on those charges related to defrauding her investors, the one she was found guilty of. As we said, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 of those counts, but the jury remained undecided on the other 3. What was the distinction in those charges, and what do you make of that?
Well, the key is that each of those were discrete charges involving different investors. And so they rose and fall on the credibility of the government's evidence as to each charge. But the way to read this is really a victory for both sides. For the defense, whoever thought Elizabeth Holmes would get an acquittal or a deadlock on any of these counts, especially after she took the stand and appeared to perjure herself right there in front of the government, who confronted her with all of her prior inconsistent statements. For the government, this is a victory. They're not feeling that way today, but that's because U.S. attorneys are the kind of people who complain if they get an A instead of an A+. They're despondent. But this is a win for them. She will spend, and I've done a rough sentencing guideline calculation, at least on the order of 10 to 15 years in prison, and possibly a lot more than that. And the judge will consider even the acquitted charges as what's called relevant conduct when the judge is calculating the sentence. So this is a win for the government. They would have wanted convictions across the board, but a victory for them nonetheless.
Danny, let's talk more about calculating the sentence. Elizabeth Holmes faces up to 20 years behind bars on each of those 4 convictions. Is it likely she'll get that maximum sentence?
Normally, I say no way. When we talk about the statutory maximum, in this case, it's 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 5, 65 years. Normally, that is a fictional number, and the real number is somewhere closer to the sentencing guidelines. But the strange thing about this case, or I should say a common problem in white-collar cases, is that when you have an amount of loss, the loss amount is in the 140 million, then the guidelines send the sentence into the stratosphere. And Elizabeth Holmes may be looking at not 65 years, but possibly more than 20, possibly more than 25. And again, it is that loss amount that just jacks up the guidelines, almost quadruples her level score away from her original fraud guideline.
And Danny, quickly, you mentioned how the state would be feeling about this. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about it. I just want to kind of hear your opinion on how each side did. I mean, this was all so highly publicized before the trial even began, with many people having these strong opinions formed about Elizabeth Holmes before it started. Ultimately ends with this rare case of so many different outcomes on multiple charges. What's just your evaluation of how both the prosecution and defense did here?
A lot of folks may take a look at this verdict and say, this is about favoring investors and convicting her for what she did to investors and ignoring patients. But I think that would be missing the point. After all, it seems that the case against involving the investors was probably an easier one for the government to make. It may be the case that the jury concluded that Elizabeth Holmes' intent was always to defraud only investors and not patients at all. So it doesn't mean that the jury devalued these patients in arriving at their conclusion. And also keep in mind, this is from a jaded defense attorney, that the government may have included those patients as victims to humanize the victims. After all, the other victims were millionaire, billionaire investors, and maybe the jury wouldn't have related to them. So the government brought them in for a strategic reason. These patients didn't get a conviction on them, but probably helped serve to humanize.
Danny, your jadedness means that we get to hear it straight, which we always appreciate. Ben, let me bring you back in here quickly. What's next for Elizabeth Holmes? Do we know anything at this point about her sentencing date?
Well, she remains at liberty on bond. The government's asking that be changed to a secure bond, meaning the Holmes would have to either put up cash or property. There's a hearing next week where we'll likely hear when her sentencing date will be, which typically would be maybe 1 to 2 months from now. And it's likely she'll appeal. It seems the epic saga of Elizabeth Holmes' fall from grace is far from over.
Ben Popken, Danny Cevallos, great analysis and reporting there. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.